You are listening to Hit Play, Not Pause, a feisty menopause podcast for active, performance-minded women. I am your host, Celine Yeager. Each week, I bring you advice from athletes, scientists, researchers, and other experts to help you feel and perform your best, no matter what your hormones are doing. This show is a production of Live Feisty Media. Hello, strong, feisty women. I hope you all are well. So this week is a follow-up of sorts to a show that I did with Val Schoenberg on what to know about prediabetes and menopause. And in that show, Val and I talked about how, quote unquote, prediabetes isn't really recognized as a diagnostic category by the World Health Organization. And we focused on the role of hormones and diet and lifestyle on blood glucose levels. I encourage you to go back and check that one out if you missed it, because this week we're going in again and we're going to talk more about how endurance training enters this picture. And as I've talked about previously on this show, fasting blood glucose has long been an interest of mine. In fact, I started digging into how endurance training can affect it nearly 10 years ago when a study was published that found that, contrary to expectations, many endurance athletes have higher fasting blood sugar levels than one would anticipate. And full disclosure, I have long been one of those athletes. When I started testing some of the first consumer-oriented continuous glucose monitors, the scientists that I was interviewing were openly very surprised by the high levels that they were seeing in even really young endurance athletes, world tour riders. So now, at a time when we're all trying to track and quantify everything in our lives, especially during midlife and menopause when stuff gets a little haywire, there are a lot of folks worrying about blood glucose spikes, blood sugar spikes, following accounts like the Glucose Goddess, reordering their meals to minimize glucose excursions, and generally stressed out by numbers that, well, maybe we don't need to be stressed out about. Are we getting too far over our skis looking at technology and numbers that weren't really meant to be used in this way in a healthy population, and that researchers still are teasing out what everything means? So that's why I just wanted to have a show about this. I see so much online and I see so many women in the community super stressed out and trying to change everything about their diet in ways that maybe aren't the best for them to hit certain numbers on a CGM, or worried about elevated blood glucose when maybe everything else is fine. So anyway, I was very psyched to be able to sit down and speak with one of the researchers who is doing incredible work in this area, Oxford nutrition scientist and registered dietitian, Dr. Nicola Guess. She prides herself on separating the real info we need to know from the rubbish we need not worry about. And boy, I really did appreciate her takes here, and I think you will too. I will link a bunch of her blogs in the show notes, but please do give her a follow on Substack. We need more reasoned voices out there doing this kind of inquiry and work. All right. So before we get to it, spaces are going fast for our Girona Gravel Camp at the end of April, which is going to be a simply amazing time. We're going to take the week, ride incredible roads, connect with one another, spend some quality time chilling out, having fun, and really diving in on what we want for this next phase of our lives. And honestly, as a longtime cyclist, there is no better place to plumb the depths for those answers than on the seat of a bicycle. So come join us. The link is in the show notes to sign up for that. While you are in those show notes, click on the link to sign up for my absolutely free Feisty 40 Plus newsletter, where I bring you all the training news you can use. Give us a follow on Instagram and Facebook at Feisty Menopause. And thank you for your continued 5-star ratings and reviews. They mean a lot. If you enjoy this show, please share it with a friend. I'm working on growing this podcast even more in the new year, and word of mouth is still the #1 way to do that. All right, super duper quick thanks to Previnex for supporting this show and for their ongoing support of all the shows. They have a new product out called Gut and Green Superfoods, and I have heard from some beta testers in our community that it has completely resolved some of their longtime bloating and constipation issues. I love and trust everything Previnex does, so thank you guys for your continued support. Okay, enough of me. Let's have a few words about our awesome sponsors and get on with the show. All right, Nicola, I am very, very excited to have you here. I read your work, I love your work, and I know that a lot of women in my audience, including myself, who have spent a lot of time thinking about this topic, are still very confused about it.
It's a confusing topic and there's lots of misinformation out there, which makes it even more confusing. So hopefully we can provide some clarity today.
Well, let's start with the issue at hand. On a high level, what I want to explore today is the intersection of what I've seen you blog about, athletes you see who have been told that they have prediabetes based on either their fasting glucose or their HbA1c measurements, and women in the menopause transition who are also being told the same information, and like my audience who are both of these things, and full disclosure, and I've talked about this a lot. I am one of these women. I was a long time ultra endurance mountain bike stage racer. I've done Ironman. I've done all the long, stupid things. And I have had pre-diabetic levels of fasting glucose as long as I have been tested. And they haven't gone up, but they've stayed there. However, once I hit the menopause transition, the HbA1c, that started inching up too. And I'm like, should I be freaked out? Everything else is really good. I don't even know where to start in my mind with this conversation. So I really appreciate any insights you can provide, really even where we should start when we're thinking about this.
Yeah, I mean, maybe let me say, and we'll get into this in depth. The elevated glucose you get with endurance athletes is fundamentally different from the elevated glucose that you get in pre-diabetes and type 2 diabetes. So people worry about high glucose because of type 2 diabetes. People think, well, naturally, I don't want to have type 2 diabetes. It's associated with a bunch of poor health outcomes. But the high blood glucose in type 2 diabetes is caused by insulin resistance, beta cells not working properly. And those are caused by things lower down, inactivity, an elevated BMI, better put, like central adiposity. So people who get excess fat around their middles. They'll also have high blood pressure. They'll also, especially in the early stages of type 2 diabetes and in pre-diabetes, they'll have elevated insulin. So it's a constellation of cardiovascular symptoms, and it's a constellation of stuff that's gone wrong, primarily due to lifestyle. Some genetics in there too, but primarily this is because we all live in an obesogenic environment. But if you think about athletes have very low fasting insulin. They have low insulin overall. They're very insulin sensitive. They have very low liver fat. They'll have very often very low or normal blood pressure, healthy blood pressure. They will be very lean. They won't have a lot of fat around their middle. And what is causing, we think, the elevated blood glucose, probably at this point, it's all of the hormones that are involved in performance. So the causes are completely different. So although the symptom is the same, elevated glucose, the causes aren't. So I mean, if you've read my blog, I basically write that I don't think there's any reason to be concerned about this slightly elevated blood glucose in athletes. And I think the fact that your fasting glucose, yes, it was elevated, but it never went up and up. Whereas if you were at risk of type 2 diabetes, your glucose would go up and up every couple of years.
That makes a lot of sense because it's been that way since I was 30 something, whenever the first time I
Yeah.
tested it.
Yeah.
And the doctor said, this is scary. And I never went back, if I'm honest. I never went back to the doctor
It's
to
a
look at
normal
it.
response. You don't want to hear it.
Yeah. Not my proudest moment, but I'm honest on this show. Um, that does bring me to think that makes perfect sense. Now, let's take this same population, and I am in this population, through the menopause transition where, even with the best of intentions, many of us gain some of that central adiposity. We can keep it to some sort of level, but most of us do because that's where that fat migrates. And there does seem to be a bit more insulin resistance showing up as our hormones change. How does this change the picture for us?
I mean, it's a bit messier. So maybe let's use some hypothetical examples.
Mhm.
So ignoring athletes, if we just talk about men and women. So women are more likely to have elevated 2-hour glucose. So let me explain that. When you have type 2 diabetes or pre-diabetes, your blood glucose could be elevated in the fasting state or in the postprandial state. That means after meal state, or both. In general, in pre-diabetes, it's one or the other because it's the
Okay.
early stages. Men are more likely to have elevated fasting. So very often their postprandial, their post-meal glucose is better. So they tend to have this dominant elevated fasting condition. Women tend to have elevated postprandial glucose when they get pre-diabetes. So not athletes, when
Okay.
women get the metabolic pre-diabetes, they tend to have elevated 2-hour glucose. And what's interesting is in the postmenopausal, so if women go through the menopause, they then start getting greater elevated fasting because they turn more into men in terms of their hormones. So men have elevated fasting, women have elevated postprandial. After the menopause, women's fasting goes up because they're losing the hormones. But women on hormone replacement therapy, lower fasting, elevated 2 hours. So it's very, very clear that female sex hormones are involved in modulation of glucose homeostasis. We are different from men in how we get that high glucose, and the loss of hormones or the replacement of hormones basically mimics who we are as women and how we express that glucose.
That makes sense too. I keep wondering what that actually means in terms of our health, because it's not like all postmenopausal women skate straight into diabetes. That's just not true.
Yes. So let me follow up on that. I think it's really important to remember it's very, very natural when we get pre-diabetes. So anyone that's had a diagnosis of pre-diabetes immediately, because of the word pre,
Right.
you immediately think, all right, I'm on the way. Actually, that's not true. It's more of an intermediate state of hyperglycemia. And on average, if you took 100 people who've got pre-diabetes in 1 year, a third of them in that year would go back to normal glucose. A third of them would stay pre-diabetic, and a third would go on to develop type 2 diabetes. So it even just considering the name pre-diabetes, it doesn't mean people are going to go on and develop pre-diabetes. It's actually quite a poor predictor of medium-term risk of type 2 diabetes. And there's a lot of controversy in the field about why we even measure this, why we even consider pre-diabetes a thing. Because a lot of people think we're freaking people out and we're over-medicalizing something that for most people is a lifestyle issue. Now, having said that, if you take someone whose mum and dad, or just one first-degree relative has type 2 diabetes, and they tend to be inactive, and their diet's not great, and they are putting on a lot of weight, if that person comes up as pre-diabetic, the chances are they are genuinely at high risk of developing type 2. Conversely, someone who has gone through the menopause, has a healthy diet, is active, and I'm not even talking athletes here, I'm just talking an average, healthy, reasonably active person. It is a natural part of the aging process for your glucose to start going up.
Yep.
And it doesn't mean you are going to develop type 2 diabetes. In fact, if we look at the global prevalence of type 2 diabetes, about 2/3 of the growth of the prevalence is lifestyle. It's being overweight and being inactive. But a third of that increase is aging, because we're all living longer. So I do want to reassure people, it actually is normal for your glucose to creep up over the years. It doesn't mean anything pathogenic is happening.
So then what is the best way for us to screen and think about this? I mean, before we go any further, because we have these instruments, right? We take our fasting glucose, or we look at our A1C, or what should we be actually thinking about? Should we all take an oral glucose tolerance test? Or do we need not to worry so much about continually testing this kind of stuff?
I mean, an annual for people, A1C is a good measure. So hemoglobin A1C is the easiest thing to do for most people because it's one off. You don't need to fast for it. It gives you an indication of what your glucose has been over the past 1 to 3 months, depending. There are some contraindications. There are some people for whom that's not the best measure, and a doctor will be aware of that. An annual A1C is probably sufficient.
Okay.
But glucose, like I said, is only a tiny part of the picture. Like I mean, so my dad, for example, my dad is 6'4", skinny as hell, long distance runner, no family history of type 2, reasonable diet. I give him advice, but he doesn't listen to me to improve it. And he got a letter from the GP because we have a national screening program about you've got pre-diabetes.
Wow.
It might have been aging, it might have been the fact that he's very, very active. And I kind of said, like, Dad, look, your blood pressure is low. You are ludicrously active. I think his resting heart rate was probably like 55 beats a minute or something, maybe lower. And the reason why we care about diabetes is because of cardiovascular risk. Okay, we care
Right.
about diabetes for two things. Retinopathy, so this is a kind of blindness, nerve damage. That only is a problem, it only becomes relevant when people actually get into type 2 diabetes. In pre-diabetes, the reason why we care about it is either development of type 2 or cardiovascular disease. And so in terms of development of type 2, like I said, if you don't have a family history, if you're active, etc., your chances of developing type 2 are minimal. And then let's consider cardiovascular disease. Well, again, if just your glucose is mildly elevated, but you've got normal blood pressure and you're active and your heart's strong and all of that, your risk of cardiovascular disease is very small. Glucose itself is a small part of the picture. And I actually wish people paid more attention to blood pressure and cholesterol.
Especially blood pressure. I feel like blood pressure, people sleep on it. I really do.
Blood pressure, yeah.
And that's a big one. That's like a
Yeah.
really important one. Yeah, I agree with that. And thank you for that clarification because I show up like a unicorn sometimes to the regular doctor, but now I have a sports specific doctor and she sees a lot of people like me. My blood pressure is low. My triglycerides are low. My resting heart rate is like 39.
Whoa.
Yeah, so all like
Um,
I've had my coronary arteries, they are clear, but I've had this pre-diabetic blood sugar literally for 20, I don't know, as long as I know, and and it always bugs me. So this is making me feel better for sure.
yeah, I mean, I wouldn't be. I mean, I do think checking annually, I think there needs to be a balance between, okay, let me check on things so I can intervene if I need to,
Yeah.
because there is some genetics to all of these things.
Yeah.
And there are some people, I've seen patients with no family history of type 2. I mean, they're not necessarily athletes, but they're active, they're lean and all of
Yeah.
that. And they come to me and it looks like they've got type 2, and we work with a doctor and do a bunch of tests. Sometimes you get that one person who's got just some weird genetics
Yeah.
maybe, and they develop type 2. So getting screened, getting diagnosed is really important. But I think that needs to be balanced with not freaking yourself out too much. Like
Yeah.
ultimately, like I'm a healthy person. I exercise a lot. I do so because I want to live a long and happy life. And that's my happiness is going to be reduced if I'm like, oh my God, my what metric is, or what is this metric doing, or should I be measuring this? So I think you've got the right balance.
Well, let's talk a bit about some of those factors that you had mentioned. One of your articles did mention that physical activity energy expenditure is positively related to mildly elevated fasting glucose. What does that mean?
Oh, so when I observed this in my practice, I was
Mhm.
seeing these patients who'd been they've got that letter, been diagnosed
Yeah.
with pre-diabetes from a GP, and I talked to them and I was like, really, this person? So I do what I always do, and I go into the literature and I try and read, like, has someone else looked at this? And it looked like I was seeing something that other people were too. So I contacted a physiologist, a guy called Javier Gonzalez. He's a fantastic scientist. And
Yeah,
I
I
know
know
he
that
does a
name.
lot of work on this. So I emailed him and I'm like, Javi, like, what do you think about this? And I always speculate about what I think is going on. And I think he went away and looked up some data he had where they had measured objectively. So rather than like guessing at how much activity someone doing, they objectively measured like the load, the volume of activity people were doing. And he found that was correlated to fasting, or negatively correlated to fasting sorry, positively correlated to
Yes.
fasting glucose. So the more activity people were doing objectively, the higher their fasting glucose were. So to me, that's reassurance that yes, it seems to be true that the more volume of activity you're doing as an endurance athlete, the higher your glucose is going to be.
And why is that? And to full disclosure again, that is something I was testing a CGM, continuous glucose monitor for Super Sapiens. I'm not sure if you heard of that company.
Yeah, I have. Yeah.
Yeah. And it was fascinating because when I was interviewing them for the story I was writing about it, they were clearly dumbfounded by the numbers they were seeing. And like world tour riders, healthy, skinny, they're like, these numbers are very high, they're staying high. We don't know what any of this means because they'd never really been used in an athletic population like
Exactly.
that.
Exactly. Yeah.
So what is the phenomenon there that's driving that to be elevated?
I've talked to lots of people about this, and some people have said cortisol, basically
Ooh, I
stress
was going to
hormones
ask about cortisol.
and overtraining. But I've seen this in people who don't have elevated cortisol, and in the literature, not everybody does, and it doesn't necessarily seem to be something that's associated with overtraining. What it might be, and so your A1C, like your A1C is an average level,
Mhm.
and we don't know precisely how high your glucose has to be for how long to push your A1C up. And it
Um,
might be, so for example, with people that are like doing activity, now that they're wearing these CGMs, like you say, we never had this data before, but now they're wearing them, you get to see how freaky the glucose can be in response to activity.
yeah.
So, for example, in high intensity, like HIIT activity, the glucose seems to go up during and also sometimes afterwards. In long-term endurance activity, people can become very glucose intolerant immediately afterwards. So if anyone eats anything after a period of endurance or really intensive aerobic activity, boom, their glucose goes
I
up.
saw that too, like a rocket ship.
Sometimes the day afterwards, they'll be glucose intolerant, which was surprising because we didn't used to think that happened. So it might just be in response to activity where your body's like responding in a freakish way with like an increase in glucose after you finish, an increase in glucose the morning after. If that's happening frequently enough, maybe that is what is pushing up the average glucose.
That makes sense.
But on the other hand, I don't know why that would contribute to just fasting glucose being elevated, because glucose intolerance is normally when you consume glucose after you eat it, it goes up. The physiology of fasting glucose is different. And I really do wonder whether there is some kind of adaptation that's happening. That it's almost like the body, like you said, from the age of 30, your body knows it is going to be training at a high level. And when you do a lot of endurance activity, the body needs carbohydrate to be available in the blood. Doesn't matter whether it's coming from a gel, coming from the liver, it
Yeah.
needs carbohydrate in the blood. And I wonder whether there is some kind of adaptation that takes place, whether it just upregulates the amount of glucose you've got available in the basal state, so in the fasting background state. And again, that to me would indicate this actually is a healthy physiological adaptation. It's not pathogenic, like, oh, you've got insulin resistance and your beta cells aren't working. It's a natural, useful response. If you're going to be getting on your bike to go,
At
how
any
many
given
miles?
moment.
Yeah, how many miles do you go on a bike?
Anywhere 50, 100. Yeah, it
I
could
mean,
be.
I would just be so surprised, but because your body adapts to a low carbohydrate, for example. Like if you follow a low carbohydrate, we can measure the way the beta cells adapt and the way your tissues do to that. And that's in 5 days. I would be so surprised if the body didn't have a way of adapting to this high level activity in a way that it changes the way you metabolize fuel.
That makes so much sense. I mean, it makes so much sense, right?
Mm.
And I want to talk about cortisol, but first I want to dive in a little bit on how the insulin response is different with active people, because that you explored that in one of your blogs too.
Yeah, there isn't much research on this, but where it's been tested, the insulin response is better in the sense that athletes, endurance athletes, need a very small amount of insulin to control glucose, which is probably a very, very good thing. Like if you
Yeah.
look at the amount, like they showed the little peaks, like in a non-trained person, if they have like 2 slices of bread, they'll need to get a lot of insulin to get the glucose down. In
Right.
athletes, it's like boom,
Right.
like just a tiny, because they're so insulin sensitive.
Yeah.
And when you're athletic, your muscles are pulling the glucose out of the blood. So you only need a tiny amount. So
Yeah.
that's probably a very good thing.
That makes sense. So let's talk a bit about cortisol because man, that comes up as a culprit, especially in women and especially in women in the menopause transition. Cortisol is like this demon coming out of the closet. Um, what role do you think it's playing with this glucose picture that we've painted? And I will share that when I was doing my CGM experiments, one of the lessons, and maybe the biggest lesson, Nicola, that I pulled out is stress really does have an impact, at least on
Oh yeah.
myself. Like
Yeah.
there was two interesting examples that I pulled from it. Like I would be chilled out in the evening, whatever, and something would come up on my Slack or something would come up on work, and there would be a bit of a stressful situation, and I could see the rise in real time. I could see my blood sugar spike, even though I had been super chill. And more interestingly, I would have the same meal like during the week when I'm working at my desk, which I don't like to do, eat and work, but I would do that. And, say it's pad thai, my blood sugar is like all over the place. But if I ate that meal with a bunch of friends around a table on a Friday night when we're all chill, completely different blood glucose response to it.
Yeah. Oh, stress definitely affects glucose. So there have been like experimental trials where they mimic like a maths exam or where they have people do a public speaking
Oh boy.
exercise and you see it and it's a big amount. I mean
Yeah.
it's like 1 to 2 millimole per liter. So that's like 18 to 36 milligram per deciliter. Like that's how much the difference can be just with fairly moderate stress. I mean, it's not life altering, but stressful situations that we encounter every day. So definitely stress acutely, like in the short term, will push up your blood glucose. I think where there is concern around cortisol is when it becomes more of a chronic kind of stress. And I
Mm.
don't think we necessarily think this is psychological, like, oh, I'm worried about this email I've got to send or whatever it is.
Right.
It's almost a chronic stress response. And again, there's some concern it's overtraining. But I don't think that is the reason or the sole reason for this elevated glucose we see in athletes. Because like I said, you see it in people who aren't overtraining, don't have measures of overtraining, and don't have elevated cortisol. So I think in some people it's probably a contribution, but I don't think it explains it in everyone.
And in women in the menopause transition, they worry a lot about cortisol because of how the reproductive hormones, estrogen, interplay with them. And it seems that it's harder to keep that in check. Is it a matter of purposefully trying to bring down or is that too simple? Purposely trying to bring down your stress? We talk a whole lot, and it comes up at the Menopause Society meetings, cognitive behavioral therapy, mindfulness, all these words that people roll their eyes at. But I can tell you, doing these experiments, it does seem to bring down those stress levels and then hence blood sugar levels.
I mean, I should tread lightly here. I'm not a psychologist, and also these kind of hormonal changes, in the cortisol response actually is more complicated and
Mm.
involved than a lot of people think it is. I mean, I think in general, everyone is different in how they respond to things. So personally, maybe this is a British have a cup of tea and just get on with it. Like I don't like dwelling on things. Like I know people who record their sleep. That would make my sleep worse.
Yeah,
It would
you're
just
not
make me
alone.
anxious about sleep. And so I think people know themselves. And if you know what's right for you in managing stress, then great. Like I can definitely imagine some folks who just taking 10 minutes out every day to do some deep breathing would have really profound effects. So I think that's smart. And I think it's also in terms of quality of life and just being a happier person generally is a good thing. In terms of the effect on glucose, unless someone has real stress every day, like,
Mm.
the kind of stress you get when you can feel your muscles tight,
Hmm.
that kind of, and your heart rate goes up. I think that kind of stress would increase your glucose often enough and significantly enough to impact your health in the long term. These small increases that you see with doing a math test, I don't think they are big enough to influence glucose to a degree that would influence your health.
I wonder, as you're speaking, and I hadn't really thought about it before, one of the things that many women, and I definitely experience this, it's not bad now that I'm post-menopause, but in that perimenopausal period, I had so much anxiety that I never had before. Like that was
Yeah.
one of my big symptoms. And that seems like it could drive some of this, no?
Um, yes, but I don't, compared to everything else. I mean, again, remember we started this conversation talking about how small actually glucose itself is to a contributor to the things that we worry about. Um, I think in terms of perimenopause and how do you manage that anxiety? Because I mean that's a physiological. It seems to be a reproducible effect when you manipulate hormones.
Yeah,
And I sort of think the best way to deal with something like that, I think knowledge is power. And I think
agreed.
the simple fact that you know you're not going crazy and having support groups, and like you're seeing now a lot more talk about the perimenopause and menopause, just knowing, oh, I'm not going crazy, I'm not broken. This is just my hormones going crazy and I'm responding. That I think allows you to take it down a level and also be kind to yourself and not have to be perfect all the time and feel perfect. It's like, okay, today, this week, this is happening and I feel crap. What can I do to get through it and achieve what I need to achieve at the same time without beating myself up for feeling this way? I think that's the most important thing because I mean, I know nothing about HRT. They all work differently. I'm not an endocrinologist, but I think it's just incredibly complex. And I just think accepting, okay, this is the process, this is what we've got to go through. It's normal. What can I do to limit the damage to me? I think is the best way.
Well, you've
Right?
said a lot of words that I have said myself. Like once I knew, because I did not know when I started the show 4 years ago, and it's part of the reason I started it. I did not know that anxiety was part of this hormonal journey. I had no idea. And I thought I am finally breaking. I'm
Yeah.
finally coming completely undone.
I've
Life has
seen people
finally just
because
come down on me. And without hormone therapy, I once I knew, to your point, which you said, and I have said many times in the show, I felt immediately better. Like I was like, oh, okay, I know what this is. And that just brings down the boogeyman, right? It just sort of
yeah,
takes pushes the monster back under the bed. It's like, okay, whatever. And I have, for other reasons, hot flashes mostly started hormone therapy post menopause, but my anxiety is irrespective of that. That went down without, you know, to your point of like the hormonal journey is very different for everybody. Like some people they get on hormone therapy and they find that it does help with this stuff, and some people don't,
yeah.
you know?
Yeah. And I think just being aware of it, like if you don't know, when you have these kind of non-specific symptoms, like anxiety is such a non-specific, a billion things could be causing it. It's exactly the kind of thing that sends you down like the internet rabbit hole. Because you think, my God, why am I shaky? Why am I nervous about something I've never been nervous about before? And
Yeah.
then you go, oh, am I deficient in iodine? Am I doing, and you go down this internet rabbit hole. And I've seen it in my practice so often that actually in many cases ends up being worse than the symptom itself. Just the worry and the let me eliminate this from my diet and let me try
Yeah.
this and try this supplement. That can make you feel worse than just being like, okay, this anxiety is horrible or the sleepless nights are horrible. So I think, like we said, knowledge is power, being aware that you're not going crazy and speaking to a doctor that's a great listener and a great supporter of you is key here.
Yeah. Totally agree. Let's take a little pivot and talk about glucose spikes specifically, because that is also in the ether right now, all over the place. You know, people are wearing CGMs just because, just to watch. You wrote a really nice piece on the sort of erratic glucose response that I thought was quite interesting, and you talk about protein, but I want to talk about this whole phenomenon overall. What are spikes? How much should we worry about spikes? What could be behind the spikes? Let's dig into that.
I mean, here's the short answer is we don't know. And that's the tough thing here because CGMs are new. Like we've talked about the glucose in athletes, and it's for the first time, we're seeing what our glucose does when we perform high level activity. It's like, whoa, no one thought about this. And because CGMs are so new and in the normoglycemic population, and they're not perfect, by the way, there is some error in measurement through which makes this even more difficult. We don't know what normal is. And we don't know what it means. I mean, there is this idea that smooth lines should be better, and intuitively you think, well, that seems to make sense. You know, I hear it, people talk about, well, if you go really high and low, that's going to make you hungry. But when we've done really well-controlled experimental studies where you manipulate glucose to create a roller coaster, we can't measure any detectable effect on hunger. So it's a really messy field with lots of speculation and lots of people telling you what it should look like and what you should be doing. And my view has always been, as a scientist, we should decide what we do and make recommendations on what to do and what to think about things based on the best evidence available. And my concern with worrying about glucose spikes that we see in healthy, lean people. So in healthy, lean people, I think, based on the evidence we have, it's very normal for glucose to go to 9. I think that can happen if you're having a lot of carbohydrate. Possibly 10 or 11 is getting to the point where maybe that person's got some insulin resistance. But here's the thing about focusing on glucose. If someone's glucose is going too high, like let's say it goes to 12, like that would be like, oh, that's higher than you would expect in a healthy person. It's not the glucose per se that's the problem. It's because they've got insulin resistance and probably their beta cells aren't working. So what we need to do to fix the insulin resistance and beta cells are things that aren't necessarily intuitive based on the glucose. Let me give you an example. Like some physical activity will increase your glucose acutely, but over time, it's going to make you more insulin sensitive. Having more unsaturated to saturated fat improves insulin sensitivity over time. You would never see it in a CGM though, because it's such a small, subtle effect. Having more, some things you would see on a CGM. So if you replaced processed unhealthy foods with like legumes and things like that, you'd see it in a CGM and that would help improve your insulin sensitivity. So I just worry that this focus on glucose spikes is a false flag. One, it's a symptom for what's going on underneath, so we need to fix the stuff underneath. But two, we don't actually know what is a bad glucose spike. When do we need to worry? And maybe let me sort of continue my point on this by saying what people tend to do when they worry about glucose spikes are things that make other things worse that we're not measuring. Like people think that, oh, having too much glucose after a meal is going to make you insulin resistant. Like one, it doesn't. Or having too much glucose generally is going to make you insulin resistant. Probably not. That effect doesn't seem to be true. But if we take people and infuse triglycerides, so we infuse fat into their veins, guess what? They develop insulin resistance. So what I see people doing, and I think the most natural thing in the world to do if you're worried about glucose spikes, is to start replacing carbohydrate with fat. Mm-hmm. But in some people, and this probably only happens really when people are eating too much anyway, that's going to cause insulin resistance. So there you are thinking, oh, I'm flattening my glucose curves. Woohoo. You're not. You're making yourself more insulin resistant. So I just think we are misinterpreting CGMs and what they mean.
Yeah, that's interesting. And to your point, it is so complex because I sort of played around with the paleo thing when it was, when I was racing and it came out, and going too low carb had the opposite effect on my, everything went up. And I think it's just because I was so stressed, like it was just stressing my body out to try to do what I was doing on not enough carbohydrate. Then when I started eating good carbs again, like everything, I felt better, but everything went back into where I was.
Yeah. Yeah.
Where does protein fall into this picture?
In terms of glucose spikes, do you mean? I mean, so protein generally lowers glucose. So after a meal, protein will lower glucose. So protein gets broken down into amino acids. The amino acids tell the beta cell to produce insulin. So people think that insulin is only produced in response to elevated blood glucose. It's not. The beta cells respond to elevated blood amino acids too. So amino acids help the pancreas produce more insulin, which lowers your blood glucose after a meal.
Okay.
But while this is useful, and so my research, my academic research is in type 2 diabetes, and specifically I look a lot at high protein diets. And so people always say, oh, should everyone follow a high protein diet to lower their glucose?
Mm-hmm.
And no, because number one, if you don't have diabetes, if you don't have pre-diabetes, there's no reason to be concerned about, let me rephrase that. If you don't have type 2 diabetes, and if you don't have the pre-diabetes we talked about, which was the inactive overweight pre-diabetes, if you don't have those things, there's no reason to be worried about your glucose. Glucose is always a symptom. Fixing the glucose itself isn't going to fix the underneath. So why would you need to have protein? And there's always this situation where people take a narrow reductive view. So you take a glucose-centric view to diet. Oh, this diet reduces my glucose, so it's got to be healthy. There's always trade-offs. And very often, if people are going for a higher protein diet, there might be less room for high fiber foods on their plate. And so you're going to get the negative impact of reducing fiber and reducing those plant foods. So there's always a trade-off whenever you're planning any diet. So my advice for people with pre-diabetes and type 2 diabetes, sometimes I recommend a slightly higher protein diet. But for everyone else, unless you're doing a lot of weight training, etc., there's no reason to do it for your glucose.
Gotcha. So let's talk a bit about glycation.
Yeah.
Because that comes up with, everybody knows the glucose goddess is quite popular. She's got a massive following. And there's a lot of stuff going on that has just entered the general public that is striking to me. I'll just use the word striking.
Yeah.
It has people limiting carbs, never eating quote unquote naked carbs, stressing carbs, deconstructing, reordering their meals. What is this glycation that we're supposed to be worried about? And does any of this have an effect on it?
I mean, so glycation is, like many of these things, when people talk about stuff like inflammation or glycation, all of these words that get bandied around, they are normal physiological processes. They happen. Where it becomes problematic is when they happen in excess. And in nearly all cases, it's chronic. It's not that your glucose goes up after a meal and comes down again. It's that you have diabetes. So your glucose is elevated all during the night when you're not eating, when you're eating. And it's that chronic nature of hyperglycemia that's harmful. And this is true of both glycation and inflammation. So
can you define glycation for the audience?
Oh, glycation is when like a protein base gets attached to the glucose. So it basically forms a reversible kind of molecule in the blood. Maybe I'm using the wrong word here, but irreversible base in the blood that in itself is not a problem. What becomes problematic is when it can't reverse. So that's a normal, that intermediate glycation is a normal process. And normally when your glucose goes down after a meal, that glycation will reverse. What happens when it becomes pathogenic is when there is no time for that glycation to reverse. And that happens when your glucose is constantly elevated.
And then what happens?
Those glycation products sort of become a bit stickier. They form stronger sort of bonds so that it can't be broken down and it can't be degraded or metabolized and then excreted from the body. So short-term glycation, reversible, great. Irreversible glycation, problematic.
What does it do to our health?
Sorry?
What does it do to our health, that irreversible glycation?
We think that it causes damage, I think, to blood vessels. So it's one of the reasons why we think that you get macrovascular and microvascular damage in diabetes.
Okay.
And actually, hemoglobin A1C is a measure of glycation. That is a glycated molecule.
Gotcha.
So that the reason why we can use hemoglobin A1C as a marker of how well controlled, how safe is a person with type 2 diabetes in terms of managing their long-term risk is partly because of the glycation.
Gotcha.
So we think it's involved in aging, damage to tissues, particularly blood vessels.
Gotcha.
But if you only look at glucose in terms of glycation, again, you are taking a reductive view. Because yes, this happens in diabetes. So far as we know, it's not a problem if you don't have diabetes. There's no reason to be concerned. But sometimes people say, well, why not? Why not just go the extra mile and let's absolutely make sure no glycation is happening? Because like many biological processes, glycation isn't just caused by one thing. There's redundancy in the system. So the other things that contribute to glycation are having foods which already have advanced glycation end products in them. So they've already got those irreversible products in them. And those are meats and dairy and stuff. And you're eating those, and the evidence does suggest they can accumulate within the body. So you might be thinking, aha, I'm going to reduce carbohydrate foods to reduce my glucose, to reduce these advanced glycation end products. But guess what's happening? You are probably going to be consuming more foods that have got advanced glycation end products in them. And
I
it's just
just
one of those
I
things that
laugh.
happen.
I just laugh because my brother is he's an explosive scientist with the FBI. And so he deals with molecules that always act, energetic molecules that always act predictably, right?
What a cool
You put
job.
them in a test tube and they always do the same thing. And he hates medical science with the strength of seven suns because we do not act like test tubes. And that's like
No.
whenever we try to deconstruct all this stuff, it seems like a lot of times kind of a fool's errand because to your point, like the body is so complex and so intelligent and and many of these things have purposes and
Yeah.
it's so reductive. It's kind of like when we're like, oh, beta carotene is going to keep us from getting cancer. Oh shit, we got more cancer. Because like
Yeah.
when they did that with the smokers, I'm like, well,
Yeah.
what have we learned? Not
But it's
much.
like it's like this with glucose though. It's like people are like, "Oh, I'm reducing my glucose. Congratulations, you put up your triglycerides and cholesterol."
Right. It's exactly what I was thinking as you were talking. Like whenever
Yeah.
we zone in on the thing, it's never the thing. And I feel
Yeah.
that way about estradiol right now too, quite honestly, when we talk, because estradiol is like the sun, it's like it. I'm like, well, what about all the other hormones? They that play into
Yeah.
this.
It's why I always tread cautiously with endocrinology because hormones go up and down and they negative feedback and they positive feedback. It's a whole complex system.
Yeah.
And it's very hard to study and understand. But yeah, and it's one of those things why the things that we know with certainty, and all of this new exciting stuff, it just makes us forget everything that we know. Like it really surprises people that in type 2 diabetes, even in people with really high blood glucose, lowering a person's blood glucose does not necessarily prevent things like heart attacks or strokes. And that blows people's minds because they're like, hold on a second, but diabetes is diagnosed by glucose. Like the glucose is the bad thing. It's like, yeah, but you've also got to keep cholesterol low and blood pressure low. And it's actually a disorder of fat metabolism. So just look, you've got all of this complex big picture, just focusing on like this much doesn't make a person healthy and doesn't prevent disease. And
Yeah.
so then I always flip that and I say, well, let's go to healthy people who don't have pathogenic levels of glucose. What contribution do you think glucose is actually making to a person's well-being? And the answer is it's pretty small. And in many people, it's actually negligible.
Woo. All right. Before I let you go, I am curious to talk a bit about fueling specifically because I'm not sure how steeped you are, probably pretty steeped in like the push to get as many carbohydrates as you possibly can. In like cycling is a big one, right? We're going to eat 500 calories an hour I mean, they're just really pushing the limits. It used to be 30 to 60 grams of carbs an hour. That's what we were shooting for. And now you have people like consistently pushing 90 plus. And I wonder, should we? Are there ramifications? Do you have thoughts about this, about like, what we should be doing during exercise as far as our carbohydrate intake?
I mean, my response would be that I don't think there's any reason to be concerned about having too much carbohydrate, whether it's a combination of glucose and fructose on insulin resistance. Like
Okay.
like Javi, who I mentioned, Javier Gonzalez, his team have done studies where they give people, I mean, I think it's like half a kilo of glucose in a very short period of time. And when the muscles are so oxidative, when they're just burning energy like crazy, that glucose disappears from the system. You don't see hyperglycemia. So I think the body does such a good job of, or better put, the body needs that energy. It needs that rapidly oxidized energy source to perform activity. So I don't think there's any reason to be concerned about it causing negative health effects. And because what's kind of interesting is I remember Peter Attia, like one of those big podcasters,
Hmm.
saying, I think he got into low carb diets because he was doing a lot of activity and he didn't understand why he was pre-diabetic. And I think he put it down to carbs. And I don't think that's true. I think he's got this pre-diabetic state. As I understand it, he was doing a lot of endurance, lots of
Oh,
long
yeah.
distance
Long
running,
swims, like super, super
swimmings,
long
etc.
swims, 12
And I think he
miles, 20
probably,
miles.
yeah, I think he probably just had this athletic phenotype.
Hmm.
So I haven't seen any evidence that suggests in people performing high level endurance activity that you see any disruption in hepatics, that's liver glucose metabolism, or muscle glucose metabolism. So I don't think there's any reason to be concerned.
Excellent. Is there anything that you think that our audience should hear or that you wanted to express to this audience that we have not covered?
No, I don't think so. I think we covered
A
most of
lot.
it. Yeah, a lot.
What are you looking at now? Is there anything that is like has your fancy in the laboratory?
I mean, we are mostly I'm focused on type 2 diabetes, and it's always interesting because I come from these conversations where people are like, oh my God, my blood glucose got to like 110 milligram per deciliter. I'm like, I just see people with 300, it's a whole different situation. But I'm really interested in amino acids on the beta cell and amino acids on liver metabolism. So that's work that our lab's going to be moving into.
Well, I'll keep an eye on it, and I really appreciate you sharing your time and wisdom with us today.
Not at all. Thank you so much.
Well, that's our show. Come on back for another candid conversation on hormones with Dr. Carla Di Girolamo. These are such popular episodes that I've decided that Carla and I will sit down and talk about the state of research, particularly in the areas of hormone therapy and hormonal health, on a regular basis here in the new year. So next week, we talk about hormone testing and whether or not we should be thinking about aiming for therapeutic levels. So come on back for that one. And until then, as always, stay feisty. You've been listening to Hit Play, Not Pause, a feisty menopause podcast for active, performance-minded women. I'm your host, Celine Yeager. The show is edited and produced by the strong, talented, and amazing women at Live Feisty Media. Follow us on social media at Feisty Menopause. And please help us spread the word. Screenshot and share this episode on your social media channels with the tag @FeistyMenopause. Share the show with your friends. And please subscribe, like, review, and rate this show wherever you get your podcasts. Word of mouth and good reviews make it easier for other listeners to find. Thanks for listening, and as always, stay feisty.